Okay, go ahead.
Jane Meherabad. Tonight we have Bernard Bruford speaking to us. Bernard goes way back with Meherabad. He actually met him in Australia in '56 in Melbourne and in '58, and then came here for the East West Gathering. Way before that, Bernard's father, John Bruford, was very good friends with our Mundley poet, musician Francis Brabazon. Great team. They were both artists. Francis actually, to earn money, was an artist's model, and Bernard's father was actually a very well-known artist and sculptor in Melbourne, which was a sort of a bohemian, rather eclectic artistic community, and Francis was his artist model in his drawing, and Bernard's father also did some of those gorgeous sculptures you see at Meherabad and around about Father's head, beautiful sculptures. And when Francis often was a little short of cash, Bernard's father, John Bruford, would always really help out. Francis Brabazon's real name is not Francis Bernard Brabazon, it's Bernard Francis Brabazon, and Bernard is named after Francis. And John Bruford and Francis both realised at the same point that Sufism was their way in life, the lover-beloved relationship. And over time, when Barbara came in '56, Barbara actually visited the Bruford's house in Malvern, and then in '58, when Barbara came, Bernard was a teenager at this point, met Barbara again, and their lives were totally the lives of Barbara lovers as we know that to be today. And then finally, when Avatar's Abode was being developed for Barbara to come there, John Bruford was very active in, and Francis, in having that place developed for readiness for Barbara. And Bernard's father, John, drove Barbara from Brisbane to Avatar's Abode. And Bernard's story is quite unique because he was a young, very young teenager when he was involved with Barbara. So, Bernard Bruford from Avatar's Abode, upon which he still lives. Jai Barbara!
Thank you, Rainey. With Barbara's grace, may I try and share some of my joys and perhaps reflect a little bit of his love and compassion, of Barbara's love and compassion. My first tangible date that I know of Barbara was in 1952, so I was 9 years old, when Francis, on his way to America, sent me a postcard from Hawaii saying the gist of which was he was on his way to meet Maya Barbara and was wondering if my parents had told me about him yet. I knew of Barbara before then, in that I grew up with black and white photos in the living room, about 5 of them on the mantelpiece. I knew it was serious business. Meetings were held at our house with Sufis and then Barbara gatherings. And I used to hate these Barbara gatherings. They were behind closed doors for the adults. And I was the one who, on those days when there was a meeting at our house, was the one who had to light the fire if it was winter and do the washing up. And my sister, 2 years older, she always had, all through school, more homework than me, so I always copped the washing up. And an indication of the seriousness of what this was all about was one of these nights washing up when I expressed my frustration or annoyance of this closed door meeting, and I started throwing the cutlery about and into the metal washing up container. It made quite a big noise, but my father interrupted the meeting and came out and spoke to me in a way that only on one other occasion did I hear him speak like that, the seriousness about it, and I'd stepped over the mark. But I don't remember discussions about Barbara. There were no videos in those days, no Mundley to talk to. I was not in contact with any other young person about Barbara. So Barbara was in the background, and he was God, and I hadn't a clue what that was, but yes, he was God, and I didn't question that. I was given Barbara on a plate, and although I'm going to try and share some of my joys, it's included in that's going to be sharing a lot of my disappointments when looking back, reflecting on the many missed opportunities I had of loving and serving God-man in human form. One still got that opportunity today, and I still keep missing the opportunities, but I really missed them big time when I was young. In 1956, Barbara's coming to Sydney, and we're in Melbourne, 600-700 miles away, and I remember it was going to be pretty exciting because I'd be going to Sydney and seeing the Sydney Harbour Bridge again. That was a big deal. I couldn't share it with my friends because there was the embarrassment of then having to say why I went there, and so I couldn't touch on that. In the house, my friends, I just hoped they'd never find their way into the living room because they were always drawn to these pictures, and there's 5 of them of the same guy, and long hair, wearing pyjamas and things, and giggle, who's that? And it's Meherabad, I could handle that, and I'd try and distract them, but nosy family, and his name's Meherabad, I could handle that, but it was the next questions. I just didn't know enough to fob off again. Who is he? And all I knew was he was God in human form, and that I knew nothing else. So that's what I had to tell them. And I don't know how peculiar. Like I felt very embarrassed about doing that. So Barbara was not something to share because I knew it was a bit way out to say he was God in human form. In 1956, the excitement of going to Sydney, and I can remember what first impressed me greatly was there's film of him coming off the plane, but what really impressed me first up was coming through customs where there's people waiting for other people arriving, and Barbara knew exactly who to pick out on each side as he walked down amongst those all waiting outside customs. That really did impress me, that he knew which ones to greet. And at Mayor House, where Barbara stayed in Sydney, I had what in retrospect was the first dint to my ego. Francis had clued me up that Barbara played marbles, and you'd better be ready and have some marbles in your pocket and do some practicing. So yes, I'd done some practicing. I thought I was pretty good at marbles, actually. And I can't remember how the situation was structured, but marbles was on the agenda. And there was about 4 young people in the room with Barbara and Erich and Francis and perhaps the other men underly there. And Barbara asked me to hold a marble balanced on 3 or 4 fingers. And from a distance of 3 to 4 feet away, sprung loaded it behind his middle finger and pinged. I know he missed the first time, but he probably hit 4 out of 6 times as I remember it. And then it was my turn. Well, 3-dimensional marbles had never occurred to me, and of course I and the other young ones, we made complete fools of ourselves, and I remember trying to explain, well, actually we play marbles along the ground, but eventually Barbara let us show him how we played, and so it was what you might call a dint to the ego, but I know I left the room very happy, and as Barbara walked us to the doorway and leaving, Barbara asked us young ones, who am I? And I was the last in this line, and the answers that were given were very pleasing to Barbara, who smiled and gestured, and my turn. Who am I? And my answer was, and I think this came spontaneously, it wasn't rehearsed, my answer was the greatest man on earth. And Barbara was so happy with his arms up, and so if I hadn't an ego dinted with the marbles, I certainly left a very happy young person. It was in Sydney that, again, I got some idea of the seriousness of Barber. The books available up till then, like there was no Mundry I mentioned, no one to talk to who had been to India. There was the discourses, which someone who didn't like reading at that age was of no interest and totally incomprehensible. God Speaks was worse. Wayfarers was just off with the fairies and just totally incomprehensible and beyond, like I couldn't comprehend the topic matter at all. And Within Humanity had English words of a length that I could understand, and that was about my only appreciation of what I knew of Barber. In '56, Francis had organised to put on a play, The Quest, and he played the role of a seeker, and most of the cast were rank amateurs, some reading their lines, but Francis, who I thought I knew pretty well, just his whole demeanour in acting that part as the seeker. I've never seen this sincerity, this seriousness, this humbleness. And at the end of it, Barber, I can't remember what words, indicated how pleased he was, and Barber was standing before him, and Barber said something which to me indicated that he was going to give Francis a reward. I know Francis didn't know, Barber did not use that term, but that's how I thought about it, and I was wondering what it was going to be, and Francis received the reward. It was fasting for 40 days with only a pint or a quarter litre of milk, coffee flavoured or tea flavoured, to repeat Barber's name or his waking hours, not to leave a confined room, and it sounded to me like a prison sentence. Like this, I knew nothing about what this Mayor Barber and Loving God stuff was all about. But what really bowled me over was Francis at the end of this long set of instructions. I can still see him put his hands together and head on the side, and in the most sincere, humble way said, "Thank you, Barber." And I knew nothing. That's one of my memories there, 56, and I've got a few memory jolters here. Excuse me a moment. It's 58, turn back, 56. Sydney, after a few days, Barbara was going to Melbourne, which was our hometown, so we go to the airport. One beautiful memory I have was at the airport, the Mundley all dressed up in their suits, and Barbara was in the centre of the area where people congregate, and obviously the centre of attention, but there was a retaining wall the side, perhaps with the toilet doors behind this retaining wall, but there behind it is the four-man Mundley, and if the wall's here and Barbara can be seen, I was over here where I could see behind the wall and see Barbara, and here they all are with their cigarettes and taking a puff, blowing out the smoke and having a look at Barbara and coming back and having another puff and checking him out again, and I found that quite humorous. And then Barbara started pacing up and down about the width of this room, and I remember pacing up and down, and I remember saying to my father how it reminded me at the zoo of the caged cats exercising just up and down. And the moment I said that, Barbara stopped, pointed to me, beckoned, and it was on the film shown the other night, a picture of Barbara, I think the caption was, showing how well he'd recovered from an accident, with Francis on the arm, walking him up and swinging him around at the end, and that's what Barbara did with me, walking me up and down, and at the end of the walk, wheeling me round fast and then back again. I was I'm ashamed to say it, but I was totally embarrassed. I did not like being the centre of attention, and I treasure the thoughts now, but that's how it was. He visited houses in Melbourne, including our house, and I know my father at one stage had read a book, a Zen story of the master with the disciple, how the master had given the disciple instructions to clean the path, sweep the path, and it wasn't good enough, and swept it again, and master wasn't happy and came out and went to an overhanging branch and shook it, and a couple of leaves came down, and for some reason, like I was sweeping the path, getting it ready, and I remembered that story and gave the tree a little shake, and a few leaves came down on the path. So I must have had some idea of trying to please, but I can't remember many expressions of that. It was, I guess, my respect for my parents, which drew me to Barbara. Barbara was God, and he was God. I didn't know much to talk about, and I didn't talk about it. And so Barbara did not take up much of my daily life. In Melbourne, he came into my room. We'd just come back from Sydney and left for Sydney in the hurry before that, but it was quickly to tidy up, and so everything was in neat little piles. And Barbara, when he came into my room, asked, "Is it always like this?" And I had to explain no, that it wasn't. And in the house there was one room which was my father's workroom, and the junk room. No one ever went in there who were not family. No one. It had never been cleaned. There were wood shavings, silver solder, like electrical solder melted into what was once the carpet. There was desk this thick with papers. There was nude drawings on the wall from the days at art school, and if anything broke, it just got taken in there to be fixed, which eventually would get fixed. So no one outside the family ever went in. And Barbara doing a tour of the house, and he's got quite an entourage with him, and we're touring with him, and Barbara says, "What's in there?" And Father's workroom, and Barbara wanted to go in, and Mother explained how no one goes in there, and Barbara made it clear and that he'd like to go in. My father, who was beside me, I remember his exact words were to me, "This is what you call hell with your pants down." And so a lot of people who'd been to our house for the first time saw what was behind the door, and I'm sure everyone got a few giggles out of that. Sorry. And I can remember too, when Barbara there, I felt very embarrassed. Barbara started indicating something for me to do, and I just couldn't work it out, and Barbara was patiently trying to indicate what he wanted, but Erich chimed in and said he'd like you to close the door, and not the door to my father's room, a front door with creating a breeze or something, but I was not very receptive to being on the ball as to what Barbara might want. So I guess after 56, I probably I did have another few goes at reading God Speaks and didn't get far. It was pretty serious business, but I didn't know how to be serious. And 58, going to Queensland now to meet Barbara. My father Francis had asked my father to drive Barbara. Now, in 1956, Francis had alerted my father that he might be needed to drive Barbara, and he used to have vintage cars, but because he was incapacitated with polio from a young age, only 4'6" high, and vintage cars became too much for him, but what kind of car to buy? And he got a second-hand Peugeot. He thought that might satisfy a discerning motoring enthusiast, but might be driving Barbara. Okay, have to get a heater. They didn't make a heater for that model, so I remember my father's attitude, can't buy one, you make one. And I can remember him winding these coils and testing the heater and getting it right, but he didn't drive Barbara, and I know that was a bit of a disappointment, but in 1958 Francis says, "Will you drive Barbara from Brisbane to Advertiser Road, 100 kilometres?" And so here I was picking up, I thought my father was totally crazy, but I picked up a little bit about trying to please the living God-man. I can only look back and realise that my father knew what it was about. I'm still learning, but my father did know. He'd heard that decided on a 403 Peugeot. The ones being assembled in Melbourne, he heard, were not quite as good as the ones being assembled in Sydney. So my father hires a mechanic, drives to Sydney, goes through the assembly plant, listening to the engines, picking out the one that was just going to be right. It had the most terrible 1950s plush pink upholstery, but that could be painted, and to run the car in properly, continuous driving, change the oil halfway. It was just as tight the engine when he got to Melbourne as when he left Sydney. But this was my father taking things seriously. I just thought he was crazy, but he knew about how to please Barbara. And I guess I was picking up a few hints, but I was very slow. We come to Queensland, to Avatar's abode, and it's straight into work. I was looking forward to some of the exciting projects that my father had been asked to arrange a telephone system between different places on the property, and I thought I was going to be involved in that, but Francis got me onto road work. And not just on Avatar's abode, out on the government road. Avatar's abode is the end of a dead-end road, now named Mayor Road, but being put to work repairing government roads was not what I expected when I came to get ready for Barbara, and I was physically very weak, and the lifting wheelbarrows which I'd tip over because they were too heavy, and it was very hard work. And I was always looked forward to 11 o'clock, because at 11 o'clock my job was to then go and carry water about 200 metres to the house where there was no running water. It had to be taken by a bucket. So I used to enjoy knocking off roadworks in order to carry water. And then the word came that Barbara was coming a week earlier, and absolute pandemonium. Barbara's house was not finished, so started work there, and again I picked up the seriousness of it. I witnessed the discussion of Francis and my father and a few others mixing the paint for the outside of the wall, and arguments about what colour it would be when it dries, and a little bit more pink in the white, and it just had to be exact. And the Barbara's room, which is all Australian timber hardwood, the discussion of which piece of wood would go best next to each other. And one job I got put onto was nailing the floor. This is only a couple of weeks before Barbara's coming. It was real panic stations, and someone had showed me how to do it. I'd never used a hammer in my life, but I seemed to be able to pick that up all right. And then Francis came in, and what am I doing? 2 nails in each, for each joist. We haven't got time for 2 nails, just one. The second one can be put in later. And it was serious stuff. One day went to have a sleep after lunch. Lunch was 12 to 1. And I was lying down. 1 minute past 1, Francis comes in to the tent where the men were sleeping, and really got right, what Australians say, right up me. He said, "What is the point of coming all the way from Melbourne to meet Barbara if all I'm going to do when I get here is sleep? This is 1 minute past 1. Francis was very much the master. And on the very 2 days before Barbara came, there was a decision: would we put up the meeting hall or not, prefabricated? And the decision was then made we would, and we used there was no electricity on the place, we used car lights to illuminate, to get to put this prefabricated steel and up the meeting hall where we met with Barbara. When Barbara came, my father's driving him up from Brisbane. My father, he could only drive with 1 foot, but he was a very, what I'd call, nippy driver. He loved his driving, he loved following Grand Prix racing, he had incredible good judgment, could do U-turns in busy streets with just a few inches to spare, very good judgment, and he liked being a nippy driver. The arrangement was, coming from Brisbane, Francis had arranged, we're going to phone from this town, and we knew that it was so many minutes, 25 or something, before Barbara arrived, and the instruction was everyone was to be at this one location. And the phone call came, the phone went round, right, we've got 25 minutes, whatever it was. And so as you come onto the property, the first structure one met would be the tents where the men were, and then a few hundred metres further, the house where Francis had asked us all to gather. So the phone call's made, back in the car, father in suit, tie, like the man Munday you see on the films, windows up, heater on, and Barbara turns to my father and says, "Drive fast," which perhaps burnt up a few of his racing sense cars, I don't know, but I gather they went over 80 mile per hour. But this went on for some time, and Barbara said, "Sufficient," or "Time to stop that now." But the thing is, they got to Avatar's abode way ahead of schedule, and much to Francis's dismay for the rest of his life, Barbara was greeted on Avatar's abode by some of the men running away. Because Francis had said, "This is where you are to be." And Francis, he was the boss, and I wasn't one of them, fortunately, but that was the greeting we gave Barbara at Avatar's abode, people running away. In 1958, it was a bit different to 56, there was a really serious side to Barbara. And for example, talk on obedience, he asked Robert Rouse whether he would cut the throat of his wife Lorna. They both still live on Avatar's abode. And actually, this is recounted in Lord Mayor, except Lord Mayor has it incorrect, although I think it's been corrected on the internet version. Anyway, Robert said yes, he would. And this was, I'm 15 years of age. I knew a little bit about the seriousness of things, but now we're getting the heavy-duty seriousness. And like you could cut the air with a knife. And then Barbara picked on me and asked, would I be prepared to go to school naked? And I can still feel this feeling goes through me, and then a feeling of relief. I came up with an answer, and I thought, I'm going to try it, it might work. And I said to Barbara, it would be difficult, Barbara, and he let it go at that. And I was the relief. And it was very serious stuff. And he asked, did anyone know the prayer of repentance? Most had never heard of it. Some had, but no one had a copy, no one knew it. And Barbara, someone thought they had a book which had it in, Barbara sent them. And my father was asked to read it. And back in the 50s, when I was throwing cutlery about, I heard that serious side of my father. Again, I heard it when he read this prayer. I was not accustomed to him speaking the way he did. Again, this sincerity and humbleness which I'd seen in Francis when he performed the quest. In 1958, when Barbara was saying goodbye, I again felt I've blown the whole show. Something's gone very wrong here. We're all lined up to give an embrace. And I know Barbara had been in accidents. I know I was being careful not to pull him towards me, and Barbara sighed. And what went through my mind, he's broken his silence, I've caused him to break his silence. I didn't know that Barbara's silence did not mean he didn't make noises. He did make noises, but I didn't know this, and I was terrified. What had I caused to happen? Like, these were the thoughts that went through my mind. But before I get to him leaving, that farewell embrace, there's recount some other stories there. The women had all been called in to Barbara's room, and after quite a long time, they come out and they've got these little gifts from money, and Mayor had been sent out some cards, and there was a little bit of interaction to hear what had been given, and the men were then all asked to go in, and Barbara announced that he had something for us all, and again my mind was thinking, what's it going to be? And to my disappointment at the time was he had a stone for each of us, a stone he'd collected when in seclusion up the top of Seclusion Hill. It's now my most treasured possession, but at the time I can remember the disappointment. We were being fobbed off with a stone, so I'm still very, very immature. And he said, you know, keep it with you always, that stone, which I personally interpret, I'm not saying I'm right, but if I'm ever going to spend the night away from home, I take it with me, but I don't carry it with me as I go about. But so it's had 19 trips to India now, that stone. The day came for private interviews, and mother and father in us together, and I can remember the embarrassment because they were in there for so long compared to the others, and what went through my mind, there's the Bruford family stuffing it up again. Like, no thought of the joy that they were having all this time with Barbara. And then my sister Joanna and I, we get called in, and Barbara asks what we thought about living on Avatar's abode, which we'd only lived in the one house in Melbourne ever, and my answer, not knowing a thing of what was in the air, was if that's what my parents are doing. And Barbara was happy with that, and we left, and the sister gave a similar answer. We got outside, what is all this about? We had no idea. And Barbara had indicated that instructions would be coming later in that year, which they did for Robert and Lorna Rouse and the Bruford family. Robert and Lorna Rouse and their baby girl Rada, and the Bruford family to come and live on Avatar's abode, where I've had the privilege of being since 1958. After 1958, instructions came about repeating this phrase about his will soon come to pass, and at the same time to give up one cherished item. I chose butter. I can still remember at school I'd purchased a salad roll and I'd taken a bite before I remembered that it had butter in it, and I just felt so guilty. I didn't know the implications, but again I felt I'd failed. Like in 1958 at Avatar's abode, he'd given instructions, do not leave the property, and one time walking back to the tents after dinner at night in the dark and was talking with someone so as not to disturb people in the tents, we kept walking a little further and suddenly we found we were just off the property, and again, you know, this feeling of guilt of failed. I knew I was not very good at loving Barbara, but the simple instructions, I was disappointed I couldn't obey them either. And during these repetitions, my mind used to just wander everywhere, and I can still remember the joy, the relief when I heard the story of how Barbara, some wonderfully member had complained that they were no good at repeating Barbara's name because their mind was all over the place, and Barbara said, no, I told you to repeat my name, I didn't tell you what to think about. I remember that gave me a lot of relief. Oh, perhaps it wasn't too bad, my endeavours at the time, but I had all these feelings of inadequacy and not being very good at loving God. And I remember back in the 70s I shared this with Barbara's sister Money, and she patiently heard it all out, heard me out, all my failings and how I was not worthy of all the people I knew. So many more people should be the ones who had heard of Barbara, who led lives that I'd aspired towards. I couldn't match it, and all these feelings of guilt. And Money patiently heard me out, and then she half stood up. We were talking over a table on the Meherabad veranda, and she crossed her arms and said, well, that's how you feel. Well, imagine how I feel. I'm his sister. And that perhaps gave a little perspective that perhaps other people also had these feelings of guilt, inadequacy, if not being a good lover. Of course money was, but she comforted me a little bit. In 1962, for the East-West Gathering, and well, in 58 it was also the disappointment I couldn't share this with my friends. I couldn't tell them why I'd been to Queensland. That was too embarrassing. So I was a bit of a failure. Missed opportunities. I'm still missing them. The opportunities are there, but I really missed them big time when he was in his physical form. In 1962, I can remember the seriousness of how people took things in the Pandora at the back of Guru Prasad. There was a very small slit in the cloth covering and a little slit of sunlight coming down. And as soon as that appeared on Baba, someone appeared with an umbrella and just stood above Baba with the umbrella with this little slit of sunlight on it. I've got a beautiful photo actually of that. But you know, the details which people would go to serve Baba and to attend to the little things, I was very struck by that. Another thing at 1962 which I used to spend a lot of time watching for was Baba receiving all the people at the gathering, going past by the thousand, and Baba drenched in perspiration, greeting each one, accepting their offerings, etc. And I used to, as a time passed, watch Baba's economy of time with his eyes in it. The person had come up to kneel down and looking at Baba and Baba looking at them, giving full attention. The moment that person's head goes down, in most cases Baba's eyes would be up and greeting that person and this person talking around to Erich, and then when that person's head comes up, there's Baba looking at them, and like the timing was just so immaculate, time after time. And sometimes it would happen that Baba's still talking with Erich, and that person, when their head comes up, they just quietly go away without looking up. It didn't happen all the time, but this is how I spent hours just concentrating on where Baba would be looking at that person, how their eyes would meet, whereas actually Baba was greeting many people at the same time. Not related to 62, but one thing I've only thought of recently with Baba and Erich, how Erich would be the one in Australia anyway interpreting Baba's gestures, and it only occurred to me a few years ago how Baba would be actually saying things twice, once in his sign language to Erich, and Erich often a few words behind, but Baba's body language and gestures and eyes would always be reflecting exactly what Erich was saying as he said it, where at the same time Baba's feeding the next lot of things to say to Erich. So something I'd never thought of before, but I think Baba's actually speaking double talk. First time to Erich to communicate, but secondly the body language for when Erich speaks the words. And it's something which, I might be wrong, but it only occurred to me a few years ago. And 1969, come to the Great Darshan. We'd heard it, Baba had dropped his body, wondering whether the trip to India was still on, and came to India, and we were invited to bow down to this supposedly empty chair, and I didn't attach much importance to that. Okay, that's what we do, we're going to go and bow down to the chair. But for me, when I got to that chair and bowed down, it was far more meaningful, more intimate, more, for me, more important than having met him in his physical form. It was, for me, the most emotional, meaningful time that I'd had up till then. It was, it's easy for me to say, yes, I met Barbara, and I'm conscious that probably everyone in this room did not have that privilege. But I can share with you that what for me has been the most meaningful is not the physical form, it's the times with Barbara since then. I think we've all had our special, what we might call Barbara moments, perhaps up at the Samadhi or at a wedding or whatever, special, very special moments. Well, on the assumption that I'm right about that, I believe those special moments are more significant than the more meaningful, more personal than the joy of having shared the presence of his company. I'll share a little of my father's sculpture drawing, like it was actually he didn't do sculpture. Well, the only sculpture he did in the early days, I asked him once what happened to it, and Francis's place called The Dump, which was a bit of a bohemian hangout in Melbourne. When I asked my father what happened to these sculptures, he said, I got cold one night, so we burnt them all, they were wood. So I once asked my father why he did not pursue art, like there's grandfathers and great-grandfathers who got names as artists, and my father had told the story how he'd given it up because he realised he had nothing to say. And it was back in it was now at Avatar's abode in the 1960s that one day he became quite distressed and announced what a fool he had been. Here he is where he did have something to say and had had something to say for some time and hadn't been saying it in terms of art. It arose from when we at Avatar's abode would, for Barbara's birthday, send a card, and the Rouses and Brufords and perhaps May Lundquist, Diana Snow, Dinah's mother, those who are about living in the area, would take it in turns to make the card, and my father did quite a few very nice art ones, and actually with one of these cards was a pen line drawing of Barbara, which evoked a response from Barbara of a cable, and the cable said, "Your perfect drawing to the perfect one made me kiss myself." And Francis described how something he'd never seen at Meherabad before or since was when Barbara opened this card and looked at the drawing, he apparently then, I don't know, but his arm, I'm not sure, but he kissed himself. And Francis even wrote in a letter to my father how it would be appropriate that even a special building be made to house this drawing, which hasn't happened. I don't know what's going to happen to it, but my father was pretty good at drawing, but he started sculpting, and he would go to the optometrist and complain the glasses weren't right, and he could no longer see the form, which apparently he used to be very good at. And he'd get money to send photos, not to copy, but he particularly wanted ones which were completely square on, where he could get the distance between the eyeballs and the distance from this cheekbone to that cheekbone or the chin to somewhere else, and write down all the ratios, and that's what he worked on. And he did literally dozens of plaster of Paris busts of Barbara, his head, and when the shelves got a bit full, and one day when the road had a lot of potholes, he wanted me to smash them up to fill in the holes in the road. I refused. Like, he was incapacitated and physical work was not his strong point, but he put them in the wheelbarrow and smashed them up with a hammer and then told me to go and dump them in a pothole. This is the early ones. Then in 1967, someone coming to India, he asked them to bring, like, Barbara had encouraged him with this art, and her father sent along a plaster of Paris bust, and as a progress report. My father was not happy with it, and he insisted that it come back to Australia. That Barbara said some very favourable things about it, including how every barber centre in the world would want a copy, like some very words of encouragement. But my father wasn't happy with it, and then started work on a clay piece, which he worked on for over a year, and my father's health was declining further, and this wet clay, he hadn't done one in wet clay before. All the others had been plaster of Paris, splash it on, let it dry a bit and scrape off what wasn't needed. And so this clay one had to be kept the right moisture and wrapped up with plastic and wet towels and things, and he got too sick to go to his workroom under the house where he did his sculpting. At times with that sculpting I once went in, the rule was I could go there, I could watch, but I was not to talk. One time I went in there and I noticed 2 Temple Bar cigarettes, that's all he smoked, both arrived burning on the edge, burn marks all along the edge, so with 2 burning, and the rules was I didn't speak, and he's looking at his work, and as I'm watching, he lights up a 3rd one with 2 already burning. He got totally engrossed in it. And anyway, it got to the point where we could only work upstairs, and most days he'd unwrap it and look at it and get someone to turn it a little bit on its stand, and he'd stare at it for half an hour, and then get up with effort and perhaps make the slightest adjustment. And then one day he said, he was quite disappointed, but he said, I just don't think I can do any better. And then he died a week after. Wow. And we were left with wet clay, and which had to be kept at exact the right moisture and what to do. I know my father was talking of making a mould, but we found this sculptor in Brisbane. He had his own gallery and taught at the College of Art, and we approached him and asked him about casting it, and he said, oh no, it's part of the student's job in learning to sculpt to learn how to cast as well, and we explained that was impossible, and anyway he said he was sorry he couldn't, so I accepted that, and I think my sister was there too, and we got talking about it, and I had in my wallet a photo of a charcoal drawing that my father had done of Barbara's face. He did 4 of these charcoal drawings, and I just, because we were talking of Barbara, I showed him this picture, and he looked at the picture and he said, and the person who drew this did the sculpture? And I said, yes. He says, well, it'll have to be attended to straight away. And he explains that he'd have to stay overnight, he didn't have transport, we'd have to drive him to and from, and he'd cancel his art classes and cancelled his studio classes, and we drove him up with all his gear, and he made a master mould, and from that he made a mast, and from that a piece mould was made, and that's the white bust which is in the blue bust, in the one in the museum, and one in Pat's office, what used to be Artie's office. I think there's a 3rd copy still. Then the year Money died, our family, we thought look, this other piece from 1967 which Barbara had seen. My father didn't like it as much and didn't regard it as his finished work. We thought, well, most people couldn't tell the difference between them. We'd get a bronze copy, make it bronze from, not me, but I could get professional to do it, and we brought this over, gave it to Mummy as a gift, asking her to please accept it as either Mummy or Barbara's sister or chairman of the trust. And she accepted it as Barbara's sister, and that's the bronze one which is in Barbara's room at Meherabad there. So all my life I had the examples of people doing things properly, of serving God-man, of loving God, and there I was just turning it. Although I took it seriously, I just missed opportunity after opportunity of trying to serve him, love him in the way that is appropriate. So unlike most people, I haven't got to come into Barbara's story. I tried to keep him away because of embarrassment, and the question of when did I accept him, it was, for me, never a question. He was God. I'd say that from an early age, but I didn't know who God was. Okay, perhaps, not 10 o'clock, some people had indicated they might have some questions. Go for it. Judy.
Do you do any sculpture yourself or any drawing?
No, I don't know a verb from a crotchet from good art.
Does your sister?
Not really, but she's more artistic than I am. No.
Can we get a copy of the bust?
That is possible, yes. It's, yes. In bronze, they're not cheap. And in plaster, in a moment, Rainey, I will be making these available in a newsletter or something. Pardon, Rainey?
Don't forget to mention about my father also being something of a genius and an inventor.
I missed the word there. Genius of what?
Of an inventor. He was involved with our tape.
Yeah, my father was a pain in the neck in the sense that he could do anything. Like, if you couldn't buy a theodolite to mark out the contours for planting beans, to his annoyance, you couldn't buy one. All right, come home and make one. It took him about an hour and a half. Perfect. Accurate enough for drilling out for drainage in the soil. He was an electronics engineer when Barbara came in to asked him to live at Avatar's Abode. He just said goodbye to that career. Sound reproduction was his specialty. In fact, he designed the first tape recorder to come onto the market, included the rest of the world market, the Magnacorder. Like he was, despite only a couple of years of education at school, and after school he did a 5-year course to get a licensed to operate a radio station. He did that in 8 months, a 5-year course. Yes, he was a totally different league to me.
The piano.
The what?
The piano in Melbourne. The piano story. Your father, Francis the piano.
Tell me more. Remind me more, sorry.
He bought Francis took up piano, and John bought Francis the piano, but he lived in this sort of bohemian loft, a couple of floors up, and Dad sort of invented some type of pulley to get this thing from the
I'd forgotten that.
up through the window into the apartment. They actually managed to do it with 3 or 4 months with this pulley to pull the piano up.
One of the things that my father and Francis used to do in this bohemian dump in the centre of Melbourne was night at times to put some motor car in a tube across the window as a kind of a Shanghai and fire missiles out onto the tin roofs around about. So like they were very spiritual, yes. Any other of those points you'd like me to?
I don't know if you feel like talking about it, Bernard, but I know you've talked in Australia about how that feeling of having failed Barbara has actually left you now. You don't feel like that anymore. You might not want to say anything, but if you do, I think it'd be really nice.
This feeling of guilt, of not being worthy, stayed with me up until 3 years ago. I had read Barber, how he accepted everyone as they are. I knew that on an intellectual level. I've heard Erich discourse on that many times. But the fact is, I would not feel worthy of Barber, to the point where, although I'd love going to Artie, I would never go up there during the day and sit. I'd tried a few times, but I would feel it was an imposition. I just knew all my faults. Intellectually, I knew it was stupid, but my intellectual knowledge would never take over from what my heart said, or felt, or perhaps it wasn't my heart, it was stupidity, I don't know. But it was up until 3 years ago a major part of my life, this unworthiness. And as I told you, I shared this with Money, and despite what she said, of course it made perfect sense. Barbara is for us all as we are. But what for me triggered a change was something I probably had read before, but there's a quote of Barber, I think it's called Barber Loves You. It makes it clear that one should take a dip in this swimming pool and wash it all away, and no matter how often you do this, you can't pollute the water. I can't remember the quote. But when I heard it, for the first time in my life, I was able to internalise it, where I didn't have to intellectually say it's true. For the first time, I felt it, and I felt that those feelings of being a total failure, I can accept myself as I am now. I enjoy going and sitting in Barbara's room at Avatar's Abode. I don't any longer feel I'm in imposition, but it was, I could have made the story a lot longer, I'm cutting it short, but this quote of Barbara's, when I read it here at Meherabad, it was shown to me by an Australian girl from Sydney, Jeannie Baker, some of you might know, and I think that clock's off a minute too fast. Just a few more details. I was here at Meherabad by myself. I was feeling really good. Everything was going fine, and I wanted to share this, and you can't just go and grab someone and hug them, but I wanted to share it. And Heather I've known for years. She was in reception. I checked out a few times, she looked busy, and then when I checked her out the next time, she looked see if she could withstand a visit from me, and I went in and I said, Heather, I've got a problem. Oh, sit down, what is it there? I said, well, things are just going so well, they can only now get worse. And we had a laugh, and I scored the hugs. That was the important point. But that then was the night that I saw this quote of Barbara's, and for those intimate moments that I'd had bowing down to Barbara's chair in 1969, I had an intimate moment that actually went for about 10 days. Not 24 hours a day, but many hours of each day. Like I'd go to Meherabad and it was just too much for me. I just used to sit in the garden and cry with joy. But yeah, that's a long story, but that's the gist of it. And so even after 50 years of being with Barbara, there's always surprises around the corner when you're not expecting them. And I think it's 10 o'clock. Thank you all for...
So much, it's lovely.
How do I get rid of...
Yes, how do you no longer, Judy? Yes.